So this is going to be a longer reading because I've been seeing this a couple times, and this photo I've actually used a couple times in two completely different sessions, but the trauma and the energy around it was very similar. So let's get into it. So as a medical health medium, what I'm doing with my clients in their session is I read their energy and I find blocks that are linked to trauma or stress, and then I'm able to take what is in those blocks and locate where on their physical body that they have illness or physical symptoms that are causing, pain or whatnot. Now, when I first locate the block, it's like their energy reacts to me identifying the block. So depending on the severity of the trauma will vary in how the energy reacts, if you will. So if I see somebody's energy and I see a block, sometimes it'll be like a ripple effect, like dropping a pebble in the water and it'll like ripple out, which tells me the trauma isn't that severe. It's more like a stress. Maybe they work in an environment with someone who's like annoying to work with, or they're having issues with somebody in the home, but it's not like a devastating type trauma. It's just something that's like irritating them. It's like a ripple effect, but it still leaves a block because it's a negative effect on that person's energy. Now, the more severe the trauma or stress in the energy block, the more of a reaction I get from the person's energy. So sometimes it'll be like a flash, or I've had where I look at someone's energy and it'll like sway like this, or it'll flutter. So there's a variety of different things. However, with trauma on the brain that's causing migraines, because the person was so struck by trauma, their energy flashes really bright. And every time I've had that flash of energy, the person suffers from migraines and they have energy blocks in the sensory areas around the eye and in the brain, because they just experienced such an intense trauma that it's like the body was receiving so much information that they couldn't even react to all of it. It's like a sensory overload of messages to the brain, and their whole body just feels like it got electrocuted. And I'll just sit here on my end and be like, they literally feel like they got electrocuted. So that tells me, okay, definitely migraines connected to trauma, but what else is going on there? Because it always goes back to childhood, and it's been the blocks in the area that caused the migraines have just been manifesting and manifesting and manifesting. And I have seen this exact photo with where these blocks are. I have seen it in a client. It was a few years later. She did end up getting brain cancer, and she had an unbelievable amount of trauma in childhood, and she did end up getting brain cancer. So now with these blocks up here in these two clients, that the energy, the blocks, and so many things were identical, but they both had two totally different traumas. But the intensity of the trauma, they both had that flash, that like electrocuted type feeling in their energy of just being like overloaded, like sensory overload, because of how much information was coming to them as children when they were going through this trauma. So I'll just start with the one that was last year. I felt right away she had like a foggy issue with her eyes, and I was like, what's going on with that? Like I said, and I was like, I don't understand this. Like when I see your eyes, it's like you're looking through foggy glasses almost. Like there's just this fog. Is this in the morning when you wake up? And she was like, yes, every morning I wake up and my vision's blurry. I'm like drained, and then it usually goes into a headache. So this woman was in her 40s, and she's just thinking this is just how it is. Like it's a hormone issue, headaches run in the family. So this is a normal thing for her. And I'm over here like, no, it's not. Headaches do not, this isn't a normal thing. Like, oh my God. So it linked into what ended up happening, where the migraines were trauma related, because the mom experienced the same kind of migraines and the mom had the same kind of trauma. But it linked back to the age of 5 with this girl. Now at the age of 5, there's that block right there that connected to a very serious issue with her dad. She was 5. Now, my other client with a similar issue, she was 6. Very similar issue, but with a sister. Very traumatic. One was an attempted suicide, and one was held at gunpoint at the age of 4 and 5 with these two clients. And it created this block, which makes sense because it's close to the eye, and we experience trauma and our eyes take in what we're seeing. If it's traumatic, it literally causes our eyes to like tighten, and then our vision narrows. Our perception is immediately limited as we go through trauma. So it made sense that type of trauma with experiencing an attempted suicide, not the client, but someone close to her in the house, and then someone else being held at gunpoint at the age of 5, it makes sense that the block would be right behind the eye because now the vision's being affected. So then the second one, because of this trauma here, trauma is sometimes it's not just one thing in a day. Sometimes it happens over time. And both these women, it was over a couple of weeks. And so we had this one here first. Now the second one was both were removed from the home. So then you had removal of home, fear, and all this overload. And the one client who was removed from the home, the manner in which it happened was over the top. I'm not even going to talk about it. She was removed from the home, and both had very serious traumas that started with this and went from there. And then what ended up happening is, as young adults, they now are literally catapulted into adulthood without any type of resources because they've been fighting in survival mode their whole life since childhood, since the age of 4 and 5, when this first trauma hit. So now they're here. What ended up happening is this line right here is exactly what I saw when I first saw this trauma. It literally was a line of energy and it rippled to the back of their brain, which is where I could see the migraines taking place. And I kept telling them, I'm like, the migraines, it starts at the back of your head and it moves forward almost like it hovers. And then eventually it's like where you would have a hat. And both were like, yes, that's exactly what they do. And then they both agreed that it feels like a squeezing motion, like their head is being squeezed, which is what I could feel. And it was all linked to these 3 blocks. Now, all of these blocks were before childhood, like it was during childhood, and both these clients were in their 40s, late 30s and early 40s, suffering from migraines since childhood, linked to these 3 blocks. And this ripple effect of energy from basically sensory overload is the only way I can describe it, and what they had to see and watch when experiencing these traumas as children. But what also makes sense is that they are the energies on the back part of the head, which is just above the throat chakra. So their sensory overload, they are children who've experienced these traumas. They can't explain what they're experiencing. They just react. And adults aren't listening. Adults are treating them like children. So they never got to express. They lacked expression of voice. They lacked sharing their fears. They had all this suppressed energy in the back of the throat chakra, just like compacted stuff down in there. So it was generating energy in the back of the brain, but it was connected to the eyes because of the trauma and how all of this is connected, but ripples back to the energy of the throat chakra, and that they never were able to be expressed in what they were feeling or heard. So that never got to happen. That was like a whole chunk of trauma that they never got to release. They were silenced through the whole process. So now I'm going to take the same image and I'm going to apply it to something more personal, because years ago when I started my dad's Reiki healing sessions before he passed, this image is exactly what I saw. And he also had a very intense, very traumatic childhood, and he also suffered from migraines his entire life. That's all. Like, one of the main things I remember about my dad is he often had headaches, and it was just something we knew. Dad had migraines, Dad had headaches. It was a part of our life. Now, when I started my dad's session, the first thing that came through was a block in this area, which made a lot of sense. He was 10 years old and his mother passed away. The story behind that is very intense. I'm not going to get into that. But then it led to the next energy block, which is where his dad married an alcoholic stepmother who was abusive, which led to the next block a few years later. I'm a little off on the timeline because I can't remember, but there was a second abusive stepmother that came in, and it rippled back to migraines in the back of his head that worked their way forward because his throat was completely suppressed. It didn't matter what he said to his dad. It didn't matter what he said. He was never heard. His voice was suppressed. And now in adulthood, he is my dad with a hot temper because he's got all this pent up energy in his throat. So he would, lose his temper over really small stuff because he had so much energy pented up. So those small things would trigger him. He would lose his temper. And then he had all 3 of these energy blocks still impacting his physical health with his migraines. And then he had the sensory overload in the eye with his mom passing when he was 10 years old. And then it rippling back over time as this block here manifested into illness. It ripples back into the migraines that he'd been having basically his entire life since he was 11 years old. So pay attention to pain signals and illnesses, certain symptoms, random things that are happening within your body physically, because they could be connected to a trauma that's manifesting into an illness within your physical body.